Hello, and welcome to Opinion Live Streams. I am Nicole Torres. I'm a managing editor for Bloomberg Opinion based in London, and I'm here today with Andreas Kluth, our columnist in Washington, D.C., and Marc Champion, who's here with me in London. And we're going to talk about the U.S. airstrikes in Jordan and Syria over the weekend and the wider conflict in the Middle East. So thanks for joining us. Andreas, can you kick us off with a debrief of what happened over the weekend?
The weekend started on Friday in this case. From my point of view, in our time zone, Dover Air Force Base in Delaware, where U.S. President Joe Biden received the 3 coffins of the dead Americans who had been killed in a drone strike the previous Sunday. And I think it must be correct that at the time he was receiving them, the B-1B bombers were already on the way from the continental U.S. to essentially the Euphrates region of Iraq and Syria. That's a statement in itself because that's showing the Iranians what the kinds of planes that would be bombing them if it ever came to that. So these went all the way around the world and then bombed 85 targets of the Iran-backed militia, the proxy army that had sent the drone, as well as assets of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which reports to the Ayatollah in Iran. However, and this Biden made clear that this is the whole part of the strategy, that was a severe bombing. However, nothing was bombed inside of Iran. Following that, there were more strikes by the U.S. against a different Iran-backed group, the Houthis in Yemen, and there was an initial sort of retaliation against the retaliation by an Iran-backed proxy, but that did not take any American lives since. And we're
Yeah.
expecting more waves of this.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to correct myself earlier because I think I said U.S. airstrikes in Jordan and Syria, Iraq and Syria, but in response to the deaths in Jordan. Is that
Correct.
right?
At Tower
Okay,
22. Yeah.
okay. And Marc, can you just get us going on how to think about these strikes and how to evaluate them, their goal, their effectiveness?
Yeah, I mean it's a very difficult needle to thread for the U.S. president. I mean, essentially, it's been very clear that what he wants to do is to demonstrate that there is a cost to killing Americans. There had been, since the Hamas attack on Israel on October the 7th, there had been more than 160 strikes on U.S. bases and assets in the area. Most of them by these Iraqi militias. So he wanted, none had claimed lives until the attack on the Syria-Jordan border.
Mm,
So he wanted to make very clear that, there is a significant cost to doing that. At the same time, he was also trying to make very clear that he had no interest in going toward directly with Iran, which supports all of these proxies.
yeah,
And which has some kind of role in organizing it. There's a lot of debate as to how much control it has. The truth is, it has a lot of control over some and very little control over others. That you could see some of that difficulty even in the targeting of that the US did, where they hit, for example, the base of something called the PMF, which is a coalition of mainly pro-Iranian militias in Iraq that has now been integrated into the Iraqi armed forces. And the main suspect in the attack on the U.S. Base, a week ago, was a group called Kataib Hezbollah, and they are part of the PMF. And at the same time, the one group that after the attack and when the U.S. made clear it was going to retaliate, the one group that said we're going to stop hitting was Kataib Hezbollah. So it's a very kind of knotty problem to try and sort through.
yeah. And how do we think about, how this advances that first aim of deterrence?
Well,
Yeah, so I think this is it's really important to try and figure out how deterrence works. The idea is that you are going to persuade somebody not to do something to
Yeah.
to you. And the question then is how to do it. And mostly the way that we think about that is we say, we'll hit them back. If you hit them hard enough, then they will know not to do it again. Like you're slapping a dog or something. But deterrence doesn't really work that way. It really matters what the other side's goals and interests are and what they're thinking. So if you're gonna, you can hit. A lot of people have said you could go hit Iran, for example, because they're behind all this, and the only ones who are going to stop it is the Iranians. Well, you can hit Iran. There's no question the U.S. can do it. It demonstrated with those B-1B bombers that it can. But once you do, what are the Iranians going to do, in response to that? And, in all likelihood, the first thing they do, because if they do nothing, it'll appear weak, and they are a weak regime domestically, in the sense of being very unpopular. The first thing that they will do is hit whatever American assets they can in the region as hard as they can. So you will, the likely outcome is that you would achieve the opposite of what you were trying to achieve. So it's deterrence is a very delicate thing. You can succeed in hitting your targets. That doesn't mean that you'll succeed in deterrence.
Yeah. And Andreas, I don't know if you want to weigh in too with specifics on this attack.
I think Mark just like summed it up perfectly, because in a way there's some game theory. It's not unlike the nuclear strategy game theory that we used to have and still have. Biden has to weigh two objectives. One is deterrence. Mark described that, which is about trying to figure out first to have a theory of mind of the opponent, and the other is preventing this from escalation and widening into a regional war and possibly even a World War III, because there are dynamics. Once you are on an escalation ladder, no one knows exactly what happens next. So you want to prevent that. And so Biden, of course, has had domestic pressure from mainly the Republicans in an election year. They're calling him literally a coward, and all of that is nonsense. And as Mark said, they want to strike as hard as as one can at Iran, and that is wrong. For instance, like just one part of the game theory is, let's say you have a theory that the mullahs in Tehran don't want to escalate, that they think that they didn't want so much chaos in the Middle East. They wanted some. They've been building up this axis of resistance, but they weren't quite sure what that they would get this far, and they know they'd lose a war, so they would rather not escalate. However, if the strikes are so strong, then they're at risk, their own regime is at risk at home, then they must be seen to retaliate, unless there's a back channel, and even then, and then you get into a bad spiral. So I think we have to do a lot of signaling. Interesting thing, I've seen that the U.S. side has denied that so far in the past week there's been secret, private back channels of diplomacy. I was surprised, and I would like there to be. That is very important in all of these crises, Cuban Missile Crisis. There are private channels where you reinforce the signal and saying, "Look, we've got to do this, but we don't want to go the next step. So if you don't, so you have to give the opponent a chance to stand down. Otherwise, I happen to be looking at one of my favorite books across from me is about 1914 in World War I by Christopher Clark. It's called The Sleepwalkers. We do occasionally in history get into dynamics and situations where we don't necessarily understand all the possible connections 3 or 4 steps out, and then we could be in a war. And Biden, I think, has the intellectual humility to understand that and to say, I'm going to strike you hard, so there are costs, enormous costs, whenever you kill Americans, but I'll always make sure there is a way for both of us not to go to the next step.
I guess I am also curious though, like Marc, your column, I think the headline explicitly states these particular airstrikes won't work to deter further attacks. So like, I know we're trying to understand how deterrence works, but is there optimism that this will be enough? It seems like the expectation is things will be ongoing.
Well, the U.S., the administration says that they think it's going to work, and I don't have a crystal ball, and I don't have access to all of the damage assessments and all that kind of thing. But what I would say is that this has been largely performative. So, the fact, that we don't know what kind of back channels there are, but they don't really need them in this case. First of all, the US government did inform the Iraqi government. The Iraqi government at this point is extremely close to the Iranians and to the Iranian-backed militias, which are part of the furniture of politics now in Baghdad. So when you tell the Iraqi government that we're going to hit, and I don't know what details they gave, you are telling Iran. And then the second part is that it was leaked, a day or two before on the U.S. news that they would be hitting in Iraq and Syria, not Iran. And you also had reports of the Iranians, withdrawing some personnel from Syria, and so they had time to make sure that nothing was hit that would force them into a big response. And so, on the one hand, that's very intelligent, and I would say exactly the right thing to do, because you're at far greater risk once you get into an escalation and a war with Iran. Everything that came before will be peanuts. So that is the most important thing to do. In terms of deterrence, I think if you're successful in the first, you're very unlikely to be successful in the second. So if you are successful in persuading the Iranians you're not going to attack, so they do not need to get excited about this. It's also unlikely, since they have everything that was done for a purpose in their aim. Their aims are to get Israel and the U.S. out of the Middle East, and they may quiet down their attacks. They were much quieter before October, for example. They may go quiet for a little while again, but there's no reason to believe that the Iranians or their allies in the militias will suddenly stop trying to push the Americans out. So I think it's quite hard to do all these things at once. Is quite hard to. They kind of work against each other.
Yeah. And going back, Andreas, to what you said on Iran, Iran blamed the US and the UK for escalating tensions. I'm just like, what should we be thinking now about a possible response? Your column lays out, rationale for why Iran does not want a wider war with the US, but I don't know, what should we be expecting for, will something come of these latest strikes?
Well, I mean, first of all, we're just in a god awful mess. If you mean to step back, and from the U.S. point of view, the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, was kind of almost became a joke around town here, wrote in Foreign Affairs magazine an essay in October where he laid out world strategy, and he said, "Well, thank God basically, I'm paraphrasing, the Middle East is kind of calm," and then that went. That was printed and is out in print. And then October 7th happened, and he had to online, correct that, obviously, and take that out, because their strategy was they wanted to look after Ukraine, the Ukrainian conflict, and to deter China and hopefully North Korea as well, because there's very bellicose signaling there right now at the moment. And there are these other hotspots. And now they're being drawn back in here in a conflict, and we're talking about Iran the whole time, which has links with Russia, with China as well. And so they didn't want this. So and Marc has been writing about this. The next steps are, even though the conflicts aren't like technically directly linked, but they are, of course, all part of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And as long as that continues to get worse or doesn't get better, and there's no solution in sight, this whole tinderbox in the Middle East will stay like that. And the best Biden can do is try to not blow it up.
Yeah. And is he on track to do that?
I think we're in an election year here, and you get flack for saying anything pro or like one of these sides. But I actually think in general, Biden has been quite skillful in this entire conflict. And to some extent in the Ukrainian before that. He had a bad start early on with his chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. But the here in the U.S., this sort of, if you turn on Fox News or something, the talking points is that Biden is weak, weak. All you hear is weakness, weakness. They're all echoing into each other, and that is to blame for every problem in the world. With the implication that Trump would be strong, which is also not. That is simply not true. Biden hasn't been weak. I think he's been wise, and so this is what Mark and I have been discussing: is how do you thread that needle? How do you
Yeah.
retaliate? How do you deter and not escalate at the same time? And that's what he's doing. That is any U.S. president's job at the moment. And nobody knows what happens next.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I
go
would,
ahead, Mark.
yeah, I would take a slightly different view on assessing Biden's record so far in foreign policy. I mean, so on the Israel front, he, I think, has committed himself too far to the Netanyahu government. I understand the domestic, reasons for that. So it's not without cause, but nevertheless, it makes it very difficult for him to actually achieve the kinds of things that he's trying to do, which are exactly the right things that he's trying to do in terms of getting an Arab buy-in to help with resolving the issues in Gaza. On Ukraine, I also think that after the first few months of the war, once you had the sinking of the Moskva, this was the flagship of the battle, the Black Sea Fleet that got sunk by the Ukrainians. Once you had a pattern developing of the Russians not pushing the nuclear button as they were trying to hint they might. I think that the U.S. actually made some pretty big strategic errors over the last year or so in Ukraine by not being faster and drip feeding weapons to the Ukrainians in such a way that they couldn't actually win when regain more territory at a time when the Russians were not ready. Now they were ready. By the time they began their counteroffensive, they were ready. So I do think that there's a hesitancy that goes together with there is a lot of wisdom in the policies. I think you've got exactly the right strategies, but in terms of the how you get to them, I think this administration has been fairly hesitant at different times.
Okay. And both of you have mentioned here and in your pieces just how directly linked this is to what is happening in Gaza. So can we talk a little bit about the latest there, Mark? Has there been any update? I think the last we've been speaking is everyone's waiting on a potential ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas.
Yeah. So then, I mean, there are talks going on, have been for several weeks, and it's promising in the sense that we're not talking about a few days like last time. We're talking about up to 2 months, and a lot can happen in 2 months. So that in itself is very constructive. We're talking about the release of all the hostages, which actually is why it will be difficult, because for Hamas to give up all the hostages, which is their leverage, you have to have a fairly substantive deal, because otherwise they're giving up, what they have, and in the firm knowledge that, that nothing substantial will change. It'll just be delayed for a couple of months. So I think it will be very difficult. They are far apart. The Americans have signaled that there is nothing imminent, that they still a lot of work to do. But it's very promising in the sense that that you've got the sides engaging, and Hamas is engaging through Qatar and so on, and the Israelis are willing to talk. I think at this point you can see some incentive on both sides to cool things down for at least some time.
Mm-hmm. And then to go back to Iran too, I saw this morning. So Iranian Supreme Leader Khamenei called on Muslim states to cut trade ties with Israel. That seems to be going against that direction. Don't know if you and Andreas, I don't have thoughts about just the wider conflagration and whether things are escalating or we're seeing the right strategic decisions being made that should make everyone hopeful.
Well, I'll just jump in because I just heard the word wider again. If you look at it from a global point of view, and there is in this town, Washington here, this sense of just tragedy, because what you're seeing with that announcement as well, is a bifurcation in the whole world that really we needed like a hole in the head, where if you include the case of the International Court of Justice in The Hague by South Africa, speaking on behalf of the global South, you could say, but really increasingly the world, against Israel, which has to defend itself against the charge of genocide. And you can think that's ridiculous or not, but much of the world finds it at least plausible and wants to talk about it. And that is much of the world, and increasingly much of the street here in Michigan, for instance, Arab voters. There have been for a while, but there are more public letters written by civil servants from Europe and the U.S. Criticizing the Biden administration for not being
Mm,
tougher with Israel. So we have, and we mentioned other conflicts in the world before, but we have very unfortunate sort of timing in that the world opinion is turning against has turned against Israel, and has, because Biden and the U.S. is seen to be Tweedledums with Israel, turned against the U.S. and the familiar old charge of American hypocrisy when it talks about a rules-based order in other conflicts. So it is in some ways all these conflicts are already linked, and I fear are preventing our ability here in Washington to make huge progress for the time being in any of them.
mm. Yeah.
Yeah, so I would agree entirely. And I think, the only thing I would add is to say, when the Iranians say, they're putting pressure on the Arab states, which are their rivals. As I was saying earlier, the Iranians have goals and interests, self-perceived goals and interests. And those are to get the US out, to get Israel out, because they see Israel as what, hooks the US into the region. They want them out because they feel, that by weight, by sheer population, by weight, etc., in history, they have the chance to be the regional power. And their rivals in that, which is the collective, Arab states, these are the people that they're trying to put pressure on. And the Gaza, whether or not they had a hand in beginning it, but the war in Gaza is a gift from God to them, because it allows them to do all this stuff under the cover of something that the Saudis, the UAE, the Egyptians, etc., they simply cannot, oppose anything. They can't do anything that would look like they're siding with Israel against the Palestinians, because it would be, political suicide for them at home. And the
Yeah.
Iranians are making hay with that. And that is exactly what they're doing now, putting pressure on them to kill off the Abraham Accords, to kill off any kind of rapprochement, which was really worrying to the Iranians, because that Saudi deal wasn't just about, normalization with Israel. It was also about a deal with the US, which would tie the US further into the region and, change the balance of forces again. So you will see the Iranians continue to push at this,
Yeah.
as hard as they can.
Okay. Is there anything you two, want to ask each other? What are you thinking from opposite ends?
Yeah, I'll ask Mark, who's sort of much closer to the Middle East. Not, I don't mean geographically, well, that too, but what is the prospect? So I'm all deep inside the the talk here about U.S. leadership and whether it's going in the right direction, wrong, too weak, too strong, or whatever. But other people have to lead, and I think that sort of so that I'm mainly I'm interested in what do you think if there's a prospect of, for instance, the Saudis and MBS taking a leadership role, uh, or a toppling in whatever form is available of Benjamin Netanyahu, who stands in the way, and basically, as long as he's there, there's nothing any U.S. president can do to make headway.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the Saudis would love to take a leadership role in the region. They are, Iran's rivals. They see themselves as having as the U.S. kind of draws down, they see themselves as being the natural successors in terms of being the dominant power in the region. So I think they want to, but they absolutely cannot, so long as the war in Gaza continues. And for them, they've actually, quite liked dealing with Netanyahu because, he's very transactional, and they can cut deals with him. But the really the Gaza conflict trumps everything. I didn't, no pun intended. I mean, but it just makes everything else unimportant from their point of view. It ties their hands. It was a really good example of just how that happens. Was when the Houthis started hitting international shipping, and the U.S. was trying to gather a coalition and start hitting back in order to stop to clear the sea lanes. The Saudis have been trying to beat the Houthis for 7 years. They've been bombing. They've tried everything. It didn't work out, and they couldn't even say the words that they supported the US-led effort to keep channels open, and that they were against what the Houthis were doing simply because of Gaza.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you expect normally in other, like, if a regional hegemon, an aspiring regional hegemon in partnership with the US should declare itself in principle ready once we make progress with the negotiations, for instance, to send peacekeeping troops to the Gaza Strip and to fund in a kind of Saudi Marshall Plan the rebuilding of Gaza, right? That would be a great way to signal, hey, we're ready to take on both the responsibility as the quirks of leadership.
I don't think it's inconceivable that they do that in the end, but it's impossible for them to say anything like it now, because it would seem like, first of all, it would reduce the pressure on Netanyahu to fulfill the conditions that would be necessary. The Saudis have made clear they're willing to continue with normalization with Israel if there is a settlement in Gaza, and that if that settlement includes a realistic prospect for a two-state solution, and that is really the tripping point. So far, Netanyahu has absolutely declined. And until that point, I can't imagine any Arab state starting to discuss how they might, get involved in Gaza. So long as the Israelis are insisting that they're going to stay there, they're going to keep troops there for as long as is necessary, and until they've crushed Hamas, and that the civilian casualties are not their primary concern. Their primary concern is Hamas.
And just question for either of you, but speaking of U.S. leadership and what that is like, the absence that is illuminating, we were talking this morning about where has Europe been? Where is European leadership on what is going on?
Well, I would say that it's an echo of what I was just saying about the Middle East. For most of the Europeans at this point, the UK is a case apart. It is, as so often, its first priority is to make clear its alliance with the US. But for the rest of Europe, they've been hesitant. First with the Houthis, and now you haven't really heard them say much. About the airstrikes that the U.S. is carrying out, in Iraq and Syria, and the reason is that they, not incorrectly in my view, they want to keep the focus on getting a deal in Gaza, and they don't want other wheels that are spinning out there to drag them along behind the U.S. into a regional conflict that they really don't want. They want to keep the focus on Gaza, to keep the focus on getting a deal there, and I think that's the best way really to explain the European position.
And just to reinforce that, I know we're close to the end, but from what I'm hearing in this town, there's a lot of frustrations with the Europeans, which started before October 7th, because the Americans in general, as part of that grand strategy of pivoting to Asia, have been wanting the Europeans within NATO and vis-a-vis the Ukraine conflict to do their fair share. In other words, much more, and in fact to lead. And so this town, the think tanks, the politicians, I'm hearing a lot of this, are already very frustrated and sometimes angry at the Europeans and specifically the Germans, because they could do a lot more, as opposed to, let's say, the Estonians, who are doing as much as you can to help in Ukraine and now in the Middle East. And it is striking that only the UK joined the US in the strikes against the Houthis. That would have been countries like Germany often talk about a Zeitenwende, a turning point, and a new age of leadership. But when it comes down to it, they don't act that way.
Yeah, that is notable and a good place to end because we are out of time. But Marc, Andreas, thank you both so much. And thanks to everyone watching. Go to bloomberg.com/opinion for more on the Middle East.